from California.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the leader for his comments. I want to just say that the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee agree with them, and in their behalf, I'd like to make the following comments. Mr. President, last week, the Judiciary Committee voted on the nomination of William Barr to be Attorney General of the United States. All Democrats voted against the nomination. There are reasons. There's no question that Mr. Barr is qualified. He previously served as Attorney General from 1991 to 93, and he's had a long legal career. But the question before us is whether Mr. Barr is the right choice to lead the Justice Department at this time, with this president, when there are currently several active investigations that implicate this president, his campaign, his advisors, and/or his inner circle. The answer for me and the Judiciary Democrats is no. Let me explain why. 5 months before being named for the Attorney General position, Mr. Barr wrote an extensive 19-page, single-spaced memo in which he provided great detail and legal arguments for his view of the president's absolute authority. Mr. Barr then shared and discussed that memo with the White House counsel and the president's defense lawyers. In this memo, Mr. Barr outlines his views on Special Counsel Mueller's investigation into possible obstruction of justice, the unitary executive, and whether a president can, in fact, be indicted. One example, Mr. Barr argued that Special Counsel Mueller should not be allowed to question the president about obstruction of justice. Point one. He concluded that the law does not apply to the president if it conflicts with a broad view of executive authority, and that view is often referred to as the unitary executive. Under this belief, conflict of interest laws cannot and do not apply to the President of the United States because, as Mr. Barr writes in his memo, quote, to apply them would impermissibly disempower the president from supervising a class of cases that the Constitution grants him the authority to supervise. Under the Constitution, the president's authority over law enforcement matters is necessarily all-encompassing. Read the memo. This is on page 11. Further, Mr. Barr asserted that the Constitution itself places no limits on the president's authority to act on matters which concern him or his own conduct. Mr. Barr went on to explain that in his view, President Trump would have virtually unlimited authority over the executive branch. As he said in his memo, the president alone is the executive branch. As such, he is the sole repository, this is a quote, he is the sole repository of all executive powers conferred by the Constitution. Thus, the full measure of law enforcement authority is placed in the president's hands, and no limit is placed on the kinds of cases subject to his control and supervision. That's page 11 of the memo. Importantly, based on these conclusions, Mr. Barr asserts that certain presidential actions, including firing FBI Director James Comey or telling the FBI to go easy on Michael Flynn, is never obstruction of justice. In fact, Mr. Barr even said, and I quote, "The president's discretion in these areas has long been considered absolute," end quote. And his decisions exercising this discretion are presumed to be regular and are generally deemed non-reviewable. That's page 10 in the memo. This is a stunning legal argument. Taken to its natural conclusion, Mr. Barr's analysis squarely places this president above the law. To argue that the president has no check on his authority flies in the face of our constitutional principles of checks and balances and should be concerning to Democrats and Republicans. Mr. Barr's views about the power of the president are especially troubling in light of his refusal to commit to making the special counsel's findings and the report publicly available, and his refusal to agree to protect the other investigations into President Trump. When I asked Mr. Barr about this at the hearing, he said in his own words that he would, and let me give you the quote, "make as much information available as I can consistent with the rules and regulations that are part of the special counsel regulations," end quote. When others pressed him, he changed his answer to suggest that he may instead release a summary of the special counsel's findings. This is not acceptable. Mr. President, there is nothing in existing law or regulations that prevents the Attorney General from sharing the special counsel's report and underlying factual findings with the American public. And many of us believe that this report is seminal to the presidency, and the public must be able to read it. In addition, as part of our oversight responsibilities, Congress routinely requests and receives confidential information related to closed investigations. In fact, recently, Congress asked for and received investigative information, including transcripts of FBI interviews of witnesses involved in the examination of Secretary Clinton's emails. This matter should be treated no differently. After Mr. Barr's hearing, I sent him 2 letters. First, I asked him to provide Congress and the American public with a full accounting of the Mueller investigation, including any report prepared by the special counsel himself. Secondly, I asked him in writing to commit to protecting all investigations into matters surrounding President Trump and the 2016 election. Mr. President, I ask to put copies of these 2 letters in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I did not receive the courtesy of a response to either letter. Here's a man facing approval of his appointment, and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee sends him a letter asking 2 very valid questions, and there is no response. That told me something very loud and clear. Over the past year, we've seen several other investigations arising out of the Southern District of New York, the Eastern District of Virginia, and the District of Columbia, where prosecutors are looking into crimes involving foreign donations to the Trump Inauguration Committee, money laundering, campaign finance violations, as well as possible efforts by Russian agents to assist the Trump campaign during the election. When asked about these investigations at his hearing, Mr. Barr refused to pledge they would be protected from interference. He refused to pledge that these valid questions would be protected from interference. For example, Senator Coons asked, and I quote, "If the president ordered you to stop at the Southern District of New York investigation, in which someone identified as individual 1 is implicated, would you do that?" Mr. Barr responded, and I quote, "Every decision within the department has to be made based on the Attorney General's independent conclusion and assessment that it's in accordance with the law, and I would not stop a bona fide investigation," end quote. However, this qualification is what a bona fide lawful investigation is all important. In his 19-page memo Mr. Barr clearly wrote this, and I quote, "The full measure of law enforcement authority is placed in the President's hands, and no limit is placed in the kinds of cases subject to his control and supervision, including matters in which he has an interest." I really see why he was nominated. This is the offering of complete protection from the law by the Attorney General, future Attorney General, if he should become one. Mr. Barr went on to argue that if the President determined, quote, an investigation was bogus, the President ultimately had legitimate grounds for exercising his supervisorial powers to stop the matter. This would mean that the President could stop the Mueller investigation, which the President has repeatedly described as a witch hunt and hoax. It also means if Donald Trump decided the Southern District of New York's investigation was, in Mr. Barr's words, bogus, the President would have the right to stop the investigation. Think about that. Think about the ramifications of that. When Senator Blumenthal asked Mr. Barr during his hearing, and I quote, "If the President fired a United States attorney, would you support continuing that investigation, even under the civil servants, the career prosecutors who would remain?" Mr. Barr replied, and I quote, "Yeah, I believe, regardless of who or what outside the department is trying to influence what's going on, every decision within the department relating to enforcement, the Attorney General has to determine independently that it is a lawful action." Think about that. The Attorney General becomes the arbiter independently of what a lawful action comprises. But again, according to this memo, firing a U.S. attorney, even if it implicates the President's own personal interests, is a lawful action by the President. And during this hearing, Mr. Barr stated that the President can fire a United States attorney. They are a presidential appointment. The meaning of this is clear. Prosecutors in these cases can be fired arbitrarily by the President of the United States under his plenary authority. Mr. President, as I said at the outset, the question is whether Mr. Barr is the right person for the job at this time. The memo that I am quoting from, I spent a full day reading and thinking about, and it was the most extreme case of presidential power that I have ever read about. And it and of itself gives me cause to believe this is why, I could be wrong, but this is why he received that nomination. And given the broad implications of presidential power and unlimited control that Mr. Barr believes this president has over law enforcement matters, I cannot support this nominee to serve as Attorney General. At this critical time in our nation's history, we must have an attorney who is objective, who is clearly committed to protecting the interests of the people, the country, and the Constitution. That's the issue, not the president. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
Now, Mr. President, we're also going to be voting in the next, perhaps today, maybe tomorrow, on the nomination